Hey, Brassvax here. We're up in the morning. I don't know why, but when I'm hungover, I feel like I need to be more productive during the day than if I wasn't. So we're gonna get gravel voice Brassvax here to do this review of the GLX 2.5 to 10X from Primary Arms. I'm gonna be covering some of the features in the overview. Then I'll go on to observation and talk about things I noticed during the review, and then finally my opinion, where I talk about, wait for it, my opinion of how the product worked for me and didn't work for me, though your mileage will obviously vary. The review is going to be a little bit all over the place because a lot of the stuff on the scope is subjective. Things I've noticed are subjective, so yeah, maybe a bit of deviance from the normal path. The scope is a 2.5 to 10x scope, and I feel like that's a niche that's been kind of tossed aside over the years, with LPVOs stealing the low-end market, right? The 1 to 8x's, specifically 1 to 10x's, and the 4 to 16s stealing the upper-end market. End result, this is actually one of only a few scopes in this category, and keep that in mind going forward. We don't have a million LPVOs to choose, or a million scopes to choose from like we do with LPVOs. It comes with parallax adjustment, which I normally wouldn't mention on the scope. It's kind of assumed, but considering, in my opinion, the biggest competitor to this guy is a Credo 2.5 to 10x from Trijicon, and that doesn't have parallax adjustment, which, why? But anyway, the scope stands out in that regard. It's a 30mm tube, nothing too exciting, and this guy is a first focal plane scope that offers Primary Arms Griffin mill reticle. You can get other designs that function somewhat similarly, a BDC flavor at mill or MOA Christmas tree variant. This reticle, like most Primary Arms reticle, features a number of features within it. You have two types of ranging options, the ever-present chevron that seems to be Primary Arms' darling, lead indicators for running individual up close, and a number of other stuff. I don't want to get exactly into the specifics. You can find these all across the internet in a wide range of PA scopes, reviews, so on and so forth. And the reality is, the website explains it way better than I can in a concise fashion, and this would take me 10 minutes to really get into. I'm already going to be talking a lot about the reticle going forward. All it really matters is this has got a number of features. They're all pretty self-explanatory if you've used the scope in the last 10 years. This scope features turrets with a locking button to prevent you from accidentally dialing. There is some over-dialing you can do to go slightly past the 0 stop and 0 lock if you press the button. This is very useful if you want to over-dial when zeroing or using different ammo types, suppressors, whatever that cause a zero shift. The Primary Arms GLX also has a fairly large objective lens at 44mm, which is very welcome for both exit pupil at max magnification, which is a function of eyeBox, and light gathering abilities. Both of these are not a given in scopes like this, and a lot of like 4 to 16s kind of struggle because they don't have a large enough objective lens to match. This also sets this apart from a lot of LPVOs, which are forced to have very small objective lenses. This makes this not only more comfortable to shoot at range because of that aforementioned exit pupil, this also helps it in low light, dusk scenarios where light gathering is critical. The only time I found this scope fell short was shooting at roughly 800 yards when the sun started dipping below the horizon, but that is such a short time window, and really a lot of things were struggling there. So the fact that I was sort of able to function in this environment speaks to the adequacy or the effectiveness, whatever you want to call it, of this scope and glass and design. At the end of the day, you get usable glass that punches well above its weight class. Speaking of its weight class, this thing comes in at roughly $650, though looking at the website right now, it's sold out, so I don't know if that brings the price up, but it's listed at $750 right now. It comes in at 22 ounces, and the eye relief at 2.5x is extremely generous. Think almost Razor HD at 1x. That's not something you can generally always say. At 10x, it's functional. Let's get into my experience of roughly 900 rounds, most of which was long range, so longer duration shooting. How did this guy do? As I mentioned, it's going to be opinion based because reticles are inherently subjective. Like, some people prefer simple, some people prefer complex, right? It's going to be depending on the value added of reticle features. The big question here, this has a lot of features, is the complexity and clutter worth the feature gain? To me, yeah, mostly. If you compare it to other 2.5 10x scopes on the market, it actually begins to kind of become best in class, and I'll explain why. The Credo 2.5 to 10x is the only other scope I find that really offers a comparable reticle design. I actually prefer the Credo's design. It's a little bit simpler without needing all the stuff this thing offers, while still providing basically just as many features. However, like I mentioned, the Credo 2.5 to 10x is just not an option without a parallax adjust. In comes this guy. Remember, the scope is not really a bench scope. It's more of a tactical scope. Recce. So it has a number of features that make it less suited at punching very small targets, like paper, at max magnification versus more of a dynamic style shooting. That was a lot of way of the gun, magpool keywords in a very short amount of time. But getting into it, it's got several ranging features, both on the Stadia line and an auto ranging feature. I do laugh that they've made it symmetrical, so they've copied it and moved it over to the left side so the reticle would look symmetrical, which is completely redundant, but it doesn't matter, it's just funny. A big point of my contention initially with the scope, or reticle design rather, was the chevron. If you dial your elevation and you decide to use the chevron, it gets a bit frustrating past about 300 yards, where you can basically not see below where you're aiming because the chevron takes up all that space. And if you aim slightly high, right, you do a slight correction, you want to aim slightly high, you're going to be obscuring like 90% of the target. Thus, any slight holdovers are a pain. That being said, its inclusion here, kind of like with the ACOG, is an understandable comp. There's a reason even primary arms forgo chevrons on their higher magnification scope, but you have to understand here, this has a 2.5x that is expected to be functional in a run and gun style setting due to the ethos behind a scope like this. So you need something large to really catch your eye as an aiming point. Its inclusion is important to set the scope apart from a dedicated range setup, and you need something large because its first focal plane to, still exist when you zoom in. What the fuck am I saying with all this? Well, chevron sort of ends up being a necessary evil, I think, right? I get annoyed with the chevron at range, but up close, it's almost vital. I think it could have been done slightly differently. When you get out to a distance, all you really need to do is subtract 2 mils from your dial, right? So let's just say you're going 5 mils up, just go 3 mils up, and you aim here, and you end up with a much finer aiming point. You have wind calls, and you have access to the Christmas tree for good follow-up shots. Since we're on the Christmas tree portion of the reticle, let's get into it. It's great. Like, I think no one doesn't like these. Well, some people don't like them, but this stuff was pioneered with the Horus and Tremor reticles, and back then you had to pay $3,000 to get access to these things. So it's nice Primary Arms took a cue from those reticles and imported it, or designed their own rather, into a much more friendly budgeted scope. The Christmas tree reticle here is really good. It's well done. I'd say it's a bit too bold, and I would have preferred much finer etching, right? Because you're going to be shooting at really small targets when you're using the bottom half of the reticle, or maybe even just slightly translucent. But I'm aware that does cost money for finer etching, and one of the scope's biggest feature set is the price to capability ratio. A lot of people find these Christmas tree style reticles a bit too busy, especially if they're of the dial only persuasion. But in my opinion, being part of this demographic, there's actually still a lot of benefits that I've come to appreciate using this guy over like 4 months. Namely, you can spot and instantly call corrections for another shooter that might not have access to this chevron style thing, or they simply just missed their splash during the recoil cycle. Right? Because you can see impacts and relative distance, you can instantly call up 2 mils, right 2 mils. You can also apply your own corrections. You can be your own quasi-spotter. Wind calls are so much easier to make because you have lots of different hashes. And finally, if you decide to mount a suppressor and you know the offset of the suppressor, so let's just say minus 0.3 up 0.2, you can just dial that into the turrets and then don't touch the turrets and still use the exact same holds, except now instead of dialing, you use the Christmas tree, right? Versus previously, if you know your suppressor offset, you kind of have to, know your hold and then subtract the suppressor offset. So on, it's a little more complicated. This just makes it simpler. Right? At the end of the day, this reticle offers a lot of versatility that is appreciated, at least by me. My only issue with the reticle design is that there are no wind holds at the center mark, that is at the line of the chevron. So if you dial, especially in the like 300, 400 yard range, and the wind really kicks up, you have no wind holes. But like I said, I just found that, if I'm shooting at 400 plus yards, 800 yards, I'm just going to dial down to the Christmas tree because, well, it ends up just working out better for me. But let's get away from the reticle and talk about the rest of the design. The turrets. Turrets are good. They're not so crispy and, clean that you get that dopamine hit every time you spin the turret. You know exactly what I mean. But they're also not so bad that they inhibit you to rapidly dial, right? If it's so squishy, you'll end up over-dialing or under-dialing. The detent is strong enough to get the job done. And that's about it. I had a slight factory defect due to how the scope is designed. The outer cap that has the numbers on it indexes or witnesses into the lower cap due to the Z-stop, Z-lock, the locking mechanism, thus forcing it into a certain orientation, right? Typically, other scope designs, you just use set screws to set it wherever you want. This one witnesses onto the actual turret. And that was slightly offset such that when I received it, I didn't notice it right away. The turret was not witnessed properly. And I reset it multiple times, and it always wanted to be in that orientation. That being said, there is a bit of wiggle room when you do set the set screws, so I was able to realign it kind of forcefully so while holding it in place and adjusting these set screws. The zoom adjust, or whatever we call these things, is decent, right? It's not overly tough, and it's not too loose that it just wants to move on its own, basically, when you bump it into stuff. It's about a 150 degree throw, and it comes with a little nubbin, such that it's just a little bit easier, and at no point will you need a throw lever for this. This gets the job done. I also did an turret accuracy test. 1,000 spins. It was like 5 to 10 minutes of spinning this thing. And no noticeable shift in zero. So that's at minimum, 0.1% accuracy, probably even more. Durability-wise, this guy has been quite stout. This rifle doesn't fit in my gun bag, so at this point I just chuck it on top of the gear when I go shooting, and every once in a while it shifts around and gets tossed around in the car. No issues so far. Speaking of getting tossed around, the Z-lock feature, which sounds like something you'll find on a Chinese Olight, not a scope, is a nice feature. Once again, that's the feature where you have to press a button to disengage the turrets and let you access them. It's very intuitive. It makes sense how it's set up. It's a bit of a pain to, initially, set up the zero, but that's true with most scope designs. Since this isn't a bench rest gun, this is gonna be on my back, when I hike up a mountain or on my side or whatever, and the ability to prevent the turrets from, dialing themselves on your shoulder or whatever is a really good feature. It's something that does absolutely happen. Illumination is poop. It's utterly useless in the daytime. It kind of sort of maybe works for dusk, but mine at least, it's way too spilly for that as well. It's got an auto off feature, but the battery isn't good enough to really utilize it as you'd imagine with like a red dot or something. And if you rely on the auto off to keep your thing going and you just leave it on, you'll be out of juice in less than a month quickly. I'd view it more as a safeguard if you leave it on and then you put it in your gun safe and it shuts itself off and then you realize, oh, I left it on. Mine has pretty bad illumination bleed. It doesn't show up on camera very well, so I had to crank it, really high up to make it obvious to the camera, but this is for sure noticeable in low light, no light scenarios when I have it on a lower setting. It really gives the whole illumination system those cheap Amazon scope vibes where it blooms out the whole scope. Ultimately, it ran out of batteries on me pretty early on, and then I just ignored it and never reinstalled a new battery because frankly, the illumination's just not very good. That being said, this scope is quite functional without the illumination. That whole chevron thing I went on for about 5 minutes. Unlike, say, other scope designs, like let's just pick, for fun, a $3,000 Razor HD Gen 3, which absolutely needs illumination to be functional on its lowest magnification setting because the whole scope shrinks into nothingness because of its first focal plane design. You can't even see your center aiming point unless you squint. So, not great illumination, but we'll give it a pass here. Alright, let's get into opinion. We've honestly been all over, and by we, I'm referring to me, but you can't talk back, so we've been all over in this review. And so I'm going to get a little more into philosophy instead of opinion on the scope, because we've actually already just covered that opinion. I think this scope fits the philosophy of a SPR. Maybe go watch this video if you want to know exactly what I think an SPR is, right? Because it's very subjective, because the military's definition of an SPR is not what you have. So anyway, I want a rifle that functions in this SPR role, able to both extend the range of 5.56 somewhat significantly, but still be functional as a fighting rifle. That means clearing shorter range engagements, whatever, you name it. That means bulk, weight, magnification, all that still premium. I find 4-16 scopes, while perfectly functional, are just overkill for a 5.56 system out to 1,000 yards, and the cost, weight savings, all that offered by the 2.5x to 10x are appreciated, and the loss of that upper end magnification isn't really noticed. Really kind of hits a sweet spot with no extra blow. Not only that, but the 2.5x, or on some other scopes, not the primary arms, but the 2x are very functional in running gun settings, while a tight FOV 4x, right, this isn't an ACOG, on 4-16x's are a lot less usable in running gun type scenarios. Yes, I have a RMR up top, but with the 2.5x and the reticle design, I find myself not really using this so much for running gun style stuff. It's more for weird positions and lining up the scope for long range shots and night vision passive aiming. It really fits the archetype of what I need out of this, both being useful for that close range and that longer range. It's got that flexibility and it's acceptable. And because it only competes with like 4 scopes on the market, it goes from being acceptable to probably being excellent and, best in class. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate how much this channel has been growing over the last 6 months or 3 months even. I think most of you guys have joined in that time frame. Commenting, interactions, and of course, all the people supporting me on Subscribe Thanks so much. It really does mean a lot that people are willing to give me money for this little stupid project of mine. But it's been a lot of fun, and I'll see you guys around for the next one.